Welcome back. Morning, Cup.
The 56th plenary meeting of the General Assembly is called to order. The General Assembly will begin its consideration of Agenda Item 62, entitled The Situation in the Temporarily Occupied Territories of Ukraine. Excellencies, honorable ministers, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Tomorrow, the 24th of February, marks the second solemn anniversary of the launch by the Russian Federation's, the launch of the Russian Federation's full-scale aggression against Ukraine, plunging its sovereign neighbor and innocent civilians into terror and suffering. The world bore witness as that fateful day marked the onset of a series of protracted, illegal, and flagrant violations of the UN Charter and of international law. As you, the representatives of UN member states, gather here today, you can neither be blind to the ongoing destruction and devastation or ignore the plight of the people of Ukraine. This is especially so because this year also coincides with the 10th anniversary of the 2014 attempted illegal annexation of Crimea and other Ukrainian territories by the Russian Federation. Excellencies, over the past 2 years, millions of innocent civilians have been uprooted from their homes and forced to flee in search of safety and shelter. Schools and hospitals, constituting key elements of civilian infrastructure protected from attack under international law, as symbols of hope and healing, today lie in utter and calculated ruin. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine has verified disturbing increases in non-combatant casualties, with the number of civilian deaths and injuries in January of this year hiking 37% higher than in November of 2023. And in the midst of all of this, we must not overlook the peculiar situation of Ukrainian children, thousands of whom were torn from their families and forcibly deported to Russia, thus stripped of the warmth and safety of their homes and loved ones. These innocent children, unlawfully abducted, must be repatriated to Ukraine and reunited with their families at once. But we must also be mindful that the impact of this war extends far beyond the borders of Ukraine. The environment, the silent victim of conflict, is threatened by the chemical effluent released from damaged facilities and from the increased pollution and greenhouse gas emissions associated with the ongoing fighting. Further, the militarization of the nuclear sites runs the real risk of a nuclear accident, an outcome that would undoubtedly spell a disaster of epic proportions. And ultimately, the war has affected every member state gathered in this hall, whether in the form of soaring food prices or in the context of energy insecurity. Without doubt, this needless war has been a significant catalyst in reshaping world geopolitics and geoeconomics, not only inflicting direct harm on the countries involved, but also impeding the developmental progress of numerous others, especially developing countries. It is actively undermining the very foundations of our UN Charter, threatening the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity we all committed to hold dear and to defend. It has bred and accentuated distrust, instability, and unpredictability on a global scale. It has disrupted the delicate balance of international relations at a time when unity, solidarity, and cooperation are absolutely crucial to multilateral problem solving. Excellencies, we are simultaneously grappling with the existential threat of climate change and strive to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We cannot afford to let aggression and conflict derail our progress. We must never forget, war stands in direct opposition to the goals we have committed to pursue. Consequently, the responsibility falls upon each and every one of us to uphold and to defend the principles enshrined in the UN Charter, our charter, and in doing so, to ensure the primacy of and respect for the rule of law. That includes heeding the orders of international courts, particularly those rendered by the International Court of Justice in March of last year, calling for the Russian Federation to immediately suspend its military operations in Ukraine. While the Security Council may be paralyzed by division, let us draw strength from the collective voice of the General Assembly, which has pronounced itself condemning the aggression and demanding the immediate, complete, and unconditional withdrawal of Russian military forces from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Beyond condemnations, we, the United Nations, must actively work towards a comprehensive, just, and sustainable peace in line with the charter of this organization. The resolution adopted by the General Assembly a year ago provides a roadmap to achieve this goal. I note with appreciation the international consultations that have occurred in Denmark, Saudi Arabia, Malta, and most recently in Davos, Switzerland. These consultations build on the General Assembly's resolutions and represent crucial steps towards finding a permanent solution to this crisis. We must support all efforts that could open the possibility of a process aimed at resolving this conflict through diplomacy and dialogue, always ensuring that such processes align with the foundational principles of the Charter, international law, and General Assembly resolutions. Excellencies, honorable ministers, as we reflect on the 2 years of anguish and hardship, let us emerge from this place with a resounding message of solidarity and unwavering support to the resilient people of Ukraine. They have endured unimaginable suffering with dignity, courage, and resilience, and continue to marshal the strong determination to defend their homeland. As the United Nations and this General Assembly, we must stand with them in their quest for justice and peace. And as your President, I join you in this clarion call. Let us redouble our efforts to end wars and usher in a future of hope, promise, and prosperity for the people of Ukraine and Russia alike, and indeed elsewhere without exception. Let us use this meeting to reaffirm our commitment to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and to the rule of law. Together we can build a world where not only does peace prevail, but moreover, justice reigns supreme. I thank you. As announced yesterday via the e-delegate portal, I would like to remind members that they are encouraged to limit their statements to no more than 5 minutes in order to allow as many delegations as possible to deliver statements at the meeting this morning before continuing on Monday, the 26th of February. It is my pleasure now to invite His Excellency Dmytro Kuleba, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, to take the floor. Excellency, the floor is yours.
I am grateful to all UN member states who have consistently supported important General Assembly calls condemning Russian aggression against Ukraine and urging Moscow to cease hostilities. This Assembly has demonstrated on numerous occasions that the global majority stands on the side of Ukraine, which is effectively the side of the UN Charter, international law, and peace. Over 140 member states have chosen exactly such a fair stance. This represents roughly 3/4 of the United Nations. If this Assembly could end the war and restore Ukraine's territorial integrity through passing a bill, Ukraine would already be at peace. If Russia had implemented the order of the International Court of Justice of March 16, 2022, we would also already be living in peace. Let me remind you that the court indicated among its provisional measures that the Russian Federation shall immediately suspend the military operations it began on February 24, 2022 in the territory of Ukraine. End of quote. This legally binding decision remains in force today. We can also see that in these 2 years, global security has only deteriorated. More and more wars and conflicts are flaring up across the globe. One of the reasons for this is the bleeding wound in the heart of Europe. Unfortunately, Russia ignores the will of the global majority. It continues its aggression and throws more and more men into the flames of war. It persists in killing and maiming Ukrainian soldiers and civilians, as well as brutally violating basic human rights in the occupied territories. Distinguished delegates, Russia cannot ignore the voice of the world majority if we all take a principled stance and act together. The peace formula proposed by President Zelensky represents exactly such an opportunity. You are all aware of the formula's 10 points. They envisage not only the end of hostilities, but also proposals to strengthen food security, nuclear safety, environmental protection, energy security, international justice, human rights, and respect for the UN Charter. Ukraine has been working tirelessly to mobilize international support for our peace plan. In less than a year, the number of countries and international organizations taking part in peace formula meetings went up from 15 to 82. And I thank every nation and every institution, including the United Nations, for joining. This demonstrates a growing global understanding that the peace formula is the only way forward to a just and lasting peace. Most importantly, countries involved in this process represent all continents and regions of the world. This is not a Western undertaking. This is a truly global initiative based on the UN Charter and relevant General Assembly resolutions. Ukraine is now actively working with partners to prepare the first Global Peace Summit that is set to take place in Switzerland. I strongly encourage every UN member state present in this assembly to take active part in the process and attend the future Global Peace Summit. This will be a real opportunity to agree on a fair and comprehensive vision of peace. Once we have this global and common position, Russia will have no other choice than to engage in this process in good faith. Mr. President, dear member states, the scale of this war and its global implications are enormous, as well as the suffering of Ukrainians. I particularly drive your attention to the fate of thousands of prisoners of war who are still in Russian captivity. They are often mistreated, and Russia obstructs access of international monitors to them. They must be released and exchanged. Human rights violations in the occupied territories include political persecution, arbitrary detentions, torture, and sexual abuse, as well as forced conscription and intentional altering of demographics. Stealing Ukrainian children and taking civilian hostages are some of the most horrible Russian crimes. In our view, UN can and should be more active and swift in deploying existing instruments and developing the new ones when necessary to help bring back Ukrainian children deported to Russia, return civilian captives, the most internationally overlooked vulnerable group, prosecute systemic cases of sexual violence committed by Russian soldiers against Ukrainian civilians and servicemen, and crimes against environment. There is literally not a single atrocity listed in the Rome Statute that Russia has not committed in the course of this war. And it is not surprising that the Russian president himself is on the ICC wanted list for stealing Ukrainian kids. And with all of this in the background, Russia has enough insolence to try to shift the blame and evade responsibility. It spread numerous lies in order to manipulate public opinion abroad and blame others for the war that Moscow says started and refuses to end. I therefore call on everyone present in this assembly and outside of it to dismiss Russian lies. They are nothing more than attempts to shift the blame and avoid responsibility. The only reason for this war has been and remains Russia's denial of Ukraine's right to exist and its continued colonial conquest. Moscow's aim is to destroy Ukraine, and they're quite outspoken about it. Dear colleagues, fellow diplomats, no nation in the world wants peace more than Ukraine. Our country suffers the most, but we also know that peace must be just and durable. Simply putting the war on hold and hoping that the aggressor will be merciful enough to eventually choose peace is not a realistic plan. Those who say that Ukraine just needs to negotiate with Russia and end the war are either ill-informed or never followed what happened between 2014 and 2022. During that 8 years, Ukraine and Russia held approximately 200 rounds of peace negotiations in various formats and made 20 ceasefire agreements. All of these peace efforts ended 2 years ago, when Russia tore apart the Minsk process and launched its full-scale invasion of my country. Why would anyone suggest today that following the same logic will bring us to a different result? Ukraine's peace formula remains the only serious peace proposal on the table, and every peace-loving nation in this assembly, and I'm certain that the absolute majority of you represent peace-loving nations, can add its diplomatic weight to putting the peace formula in action. If we are serious about restoring peace not only in Ukraine but also globally, it is time to abandon wishful thinking and engage in realistic and hard work. The Global Peace Summit offers exactly such a concrete and realistic path to peace. I urge all of you to assist us in the undertaking. And I would also like to conclude by saying thank you to every nation that has stood by the people of Ukraine throughout these terrible years. We shall jointly prevail. Thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Ukraine, and I now invite the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation to take the floor.
Mr. President, I think that for anyone who is capable of an independent, unbiased analysis of the situation, it is obvious that the topic under discussion today at the United Nations General Assembly has nothing to do with reality and serves solely to promote a political agenda. The reality is that there are no temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, but there are Russian regions such as Crimea, the 10th anniversary of the reunification with which we will celebrate in March, and the regions which acceded as a result of the legitimate expression of the people's will, the Donetsk and Luhansk republics, as well as the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. We have heard and will continue to hear many lies on the subject today from the representatives of Kiev and its Western sponsors. Behind this is a desire not just to distort the facts, but to rewrite history in general. The fact is that the truthful, undistorted version of history is extremely inconvenient for our Western colleagues, because then they would have to admit their responsibility for provoking and unleashing the Ukrainian crisis, for years of preparing Ukraine for war with Russia under the pretext of the Minsk agreements, for nurturing the sprouts of nationalism and neo-Nazism in Ukraine, which have come into full bloom there since 2013. Of course, our Western neighbors, our Western colleagues do not want to do any of this. Their interests are served by propagating a black and white narrative where Russia is the aggressor and Ukraine is the innocent victim. However, the collective West will still have to answer for what has been done to Kiev, as well as for the selective blindness and deafness that it has shown throughout all these years. How can countries that claim to be civilized and democratic not hear, for example, the statements made in 2015 by Prime Minister Yatsenyuk that those who live in Donbass are subhuman, or the words of incumbent President Zelensky in 2021, who called them creatures and specimens? Those who are in possession of the facts regarding Kiev's actions and are not trying to replace reality with propaganda do not have any questions regarding the reasons behind the incorporation of new subjects into the Russian Federation. It was a natural consequences of the policy of exterminating its own population that was carried out by the neo-Nazi regime, which came to power in 2014 as a result of the bloody coup organized, sponsored, and openly supported by the West. Having always felt an unbreakable historical and cultural bond to Russia, the citizens living in the southeast of Ukraine did not want to submit to these new illegitimate authorities, which demanded that they renounce their own cultural and historical identity and glorify Hitler's accomplices, which were responsible for the mass murder of Jews, Russians, Poles, and Ukrainians during the Second World War. Then the post-Maidan radical nationalists began to ignore the fundamental rights and freedoms of their own fellow citizens and began persecuting undesirable populations on ethnic, linguistic, and religious grounds. They imposed a financial and social blockade on the inhabitants of Donbass, stopped paying social benefits and patients, and deprived them of healthcare services. Almost every year, new laws were adopted that made the situation of Donbass's population worse and worse. Throughout 8 years, they were methodically shelled, maimed, and killed with impunity. It would take a long time to list all the inhuman crimes of the Ukrainian punitive battalions against innocent people. I will only recall the tragedy in the Odessa Trade Union House when 48 people were killed rather, 42 were burned alive, and those who managed to jump out the windows of the burning building were shot to death. I will also recall the death of the Gorlovka Madonna during shelling in 2014. Images of a mutilated body of a young woman clutching her 10-month-old daughter to her chest flew around the world and became a symbol of Kiev's inhuman policies. However, they went unnoticed by Western patrons of the Banderite neo-Nazis, and there are hundreds of such examples. Crimea was luckier. Almost immediately after the coup, having rightly assessed the true nature and the true face of the new authorities, Crimeans made a choice in favor of returning to their historical homeland in accordance with the right to self-determination as enshrined in the UN Charter. Further events confirmed that this was the right choice. After the special military operation began in order to stop the 8-year war of the Kiev regime against the civilians of Donbass, 4 other former Ukrainian regions made the same decision as Crimea. This turn of events is extremely inconvenient for Ukraine. After all, the stories about Ukrainian citizens being afraid of Russian armed forces, stories that they will face a true guerrilla war, are completely destroyed by irrefutable facts testifying to the contrary. The people of the liberated towns are greeting Russian soldiers as liberators. They were thankful that Russia has not abandoned them. We have just seen this in Kiev, where civilians rejoiced at the arrival of our soldiers, because in Avdiivka, over 9 years, Ukrainian Nazis created a super fortified frontier from which they methodically shelled Donetsk a few kilometers away. And before the start of the military operation, the real thorn in the side of the Kiev regime was the publications of its own citizens, 1 million of whom annually vacationed in the Russian Crimea and published glowing reviews online. The representative of Kiev naturally failed to say in a statement that the Crimean Peninsula was a completely abandoned region when it was part of Ukraine. Its infrastructure was neglected, its socioeconomic problems were addressed as an afterthought and in a piecemeal fashion. Over the past 10 years, however, Crimea has been transformed. Socioeconomic projects are being implemented in the areas of healthcare, culture, and education. Real salaries in the public sector are growing, along with pensions and benefits. Thermal power plants have been put into operation. Gas pipelines, transportation infrastructure is being constructed. The acute issue of water supply, which was created by the neo-Nazis who organized the water blockade of Ukraine, has also been resolved. 2 years ago, the dam put up by Ukraine to block the water was finally removed. Vast amounts of work have been done to increase the investment and tourism attractiveness of the region. I would like to particularly address the issue of the rights and freedoms of national minorities living in Crimea. In recent years, Kiev has been telling horror stories about Russia's alleged infringement on the rights of Crimean Tatars and the erasure of their identity. However, the recent decision of the International Court of Justice on Ukraine's claim under the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination has fully demonstrated the invalidity of these claims. What's more, the court found no signs of racial discrimination in Russian legislation and its application in practice. It also rejected the false accusations of discrimination against Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians with regard to their access to media, education, and cultural opportunities in their own languages. The following fact, which came to light during the trial, is very telling. Kiev tried to accuse Russia of destroying Crimea's cultural heritage. However, it was established that our state was actually engaged in a large-scale and expensive restoration project meant to rebuild historical monuments that had fallen into disrepair and begun to deteriorate while Crimea was part of Ukraine. Projects are also being implemented in Novorossiya and Donbass to revitalize those regions and incorporate them into the unified legal and socioeconomic framework of the country. Industry, agriculture, infrastructure are being restored. The goal is to make sure these regions catch up to the national average in key areas that determine the quality of life by 2030. Most importantly, our new citizens are themselves enthusiastically participating in these processes, and they see their future as part of Russia. Mr. President, if we look at everything that took place over the past 10 years, the question that arises is, could this have all been avoided? Russia did not start this war. It came to put an end to it. All the Kiev authorities had to do was respect people's rights, let them live in peace on their own territory, study in their own language, enjoy freedom of religion and freedom of thought, to not shy away from direct dialogue with dissenters, but rather to make the necessary efforts to ensure a decent future for them as part of Ukraine. And by the way, this is exactly what was promised before the presidential elections in 2019 by the candidate Zelensky. 2/3 of voters eventually ended up voting for him. However, once in power, he forgot about all his promises and let himself be drawn into the Western geopolitical game against Russia. And the chance for peace was lost. Many people ask us, what can we do now? What can bring peace back to Ukraine? We have said many times that to do this, the goals of our special military operations, formulated following 8 years of Ukraine's post-Maidan development, must be met. We are ready to do this through negotiations and have never abandoned them, unlike the Kiev regime, which, at the instigation of its Western puppet masters helmed by Boris Johnson, refused to engage in dialogue with us and to sign the agreement already initialed in Istanbul in April 2022, instead passing a law prohibiting negotiations with Russia, and condemned tens of thousands of young and not so young Ukrainians to die in the fire of this war. One should not waste time on Kiev's futile plans to negotiate on the basis of Zelensky's so-called peace formula. It is nothing other than an ultimatum to Russia and an attempt to lure as many countries as possible into endless meetings on this utopian project at any price possible. This fabrication is already clear to many of those who at first unwittingly found themselves drawn into Kiev's deceitful scheme. If there are no real negotiations based on a genuine assessment of the situation on the ground, the goals of the special military operation will still be achieved. Mr. President, 8 years ago, on February 22nd, 1944, an order was issued to award Mortar Platoon Commander Junior Lieutenant Semyon Ivanovich Zelensky the Order of the Red Star for the valor and courage he displayed during the liberation of Ukraine from the German Nazis. He had yet to turn 20 years old. If he were alive today and wanted to honor the memory of his fellow soldiers, he would be arrested, possibly beaten, and thrown into the prisons of the Ukrainian Security Service, where he would be tortured to death, as happened to the American journalist Gonzalo Lira. This is the regime that was established in Ukraine by his grandson Vladimir, who today honors the Nazi criminals and collaborators who killed hundreds of thousands of Jews, Poles, Russians, and Ukrainians during the war, to honor them as heroes. And today, those who fought alongside us against the Nazis 80 years ago are trying to save this regime. It is no coincidence that the entire Western camp, and not only Germany, Italy, and Japan, who lost in the Second World War, are opposing the condemnation of Nazis in the General Assembly, while those who fought with the Nazis are being extolled. By the way, today is a holiday in Russia where we honor the defenders of our fatherland, the veterans, fathers, and grandfathers who sacrificed their lives defending their homeland. Thanks to their heroic feats and bravery, our nation defeated Nazism 80 years ago and is defeating it today. Happy holiday, dear defenders. Our cause is just, and we will prevail. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation, and I now invite His Excellency Xavier Bettel, the Deputy Prime Minister of Luxembourg, to take the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. I must tell you that to speak after the representative of the Russian Federation is not an easy task. I've come here, as I always do. When I speak, they leave. They take the floor, but then there's an empty chair, and so it's difficult, Ambassador, to have a dialogue. Well, I'm one of the rare heads of state and government that had contact with both the presidents of Russia and Ukraine at the beginning of the conflict. I did that because in order to have a dialogue, you need to listen to people. And even though it might surprise some people that I had President Putin's ear, I also had President Zelensky's ear, of course. But after listening, one needs results. And I saw on the Russian side that the willingness to cease the war was the last concern on their mind. And Bucha, Irpin, And just after discussions, I was told that they wanted peace, but what we saw showed that that's not what they had in mind. So today, we are here not to commemorate something happy. We are here to show that we are on the side of Ukraine. And I have a Russian grandmother, and when you say that there are Nazis in Kiev here, believe me, there are no more in Kiev than there are in Moscow or St. Petersburg. It is shameful to make people believe that the Ukraine and Kiev regime is supporting Nazis, and that Ukraine is full of Nazis, and then today to try to rewrite history by saying that you are protecting Russians against Nazis, given what you did during the Second World War. That is not good for the memory of the Russian fighters in the Second World War. This is not a unilateral attack. You're a great country. And I say that this is a very sensitive issue for me, that's close to my heart. People are trying to divide us in Europe and worldwide. There are pro-Russians, and I said this as well to President Putin when I spoke to him, that his best friends are in Pyongyang, or in Syria, or in Iran. And that shows how Russia is isolated compared to the Russia that we knew before. Russia, which after a period of communism, tried to look for partners, had cultural and political and economic relations, friendly relations with other countries. Today, it finds itself isolated. And I said this at the last meeting that we had in Skopje, and I welcome our colleague here. I said this to the Russian representative there as well. Starting a war is not great. Putting an end to a war is greatness. And it's time to show to recognize error. And today, we see the very foundations of this assembly. I mean, we've just listened to a speech that shows that anything that we might say is really out of line with what Russia has said, which is not reality. You can't rewrite history. You simply need to recognize an error. To say that you are defending the Russian population, that you want to defend today, well, Europe against Nazis in Ukraine, when the result today is that the neighbors of Ukraine are trembling. The Baltic countries, or Poland, or Romania, or Moldavia, Georgia, these are countries that are afraid of Russia and that can't sleep at night now because Russia has become an unpredictable, dangerous country. A country which does not respect any law that we would like to see respected. That's the most important thing. And you said this, Russian ambassador, as well, that it's important to recover these Russian territories. But you don't make borders overnight and try to redesign things. International law means that borders are pre-established. It's not because you're bigger and stronger that you can redefine the size of your country and take something from someone else. I mean, I had that experience in the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. We had a bigger neighbor, Germany, and now we are partners with Germany, we're friends with Germany, we're neighbors. We want to build something together with them. Just realize what you are doing. Now, I've spoken to Putin several times, and I said, when you're prepared to come to the negotiating table, we are prepared to talk to you. But you need to recognize the mistakes that you have made. You need to stop killing generations, depriving children of education. I mean, children today can't have a normal education. And how will you explain to those women and those children, those Russian mothers, that you have sent their children to the abattoir to be slaughtered just because of a mistake that you have made? How will you explain that in the history books? Will it once again be something that is going to be deleted from the news in Russia because it bothers certain people? Impunity is also something that we always have to be aware of. You can't attack someone and assume that nothing will happen afterwards. We know that your supporters are ever more reduced in number today. Ukraine is a country that's been attacked, and the attacker is Russia, and we will continue to support Ukraine. We will continue to support the colleagues today that are being subject to this aggression, but realize one day, I mean, when I was there, when you go to Ukraine, you see the strength of Ukrainians. A lot of us thought that Ukraine would fold and that Russia was going to just steamroller them. But no, they're fighting, and they're not just fighting for themselves, they're also fighting for us. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Luxembourg, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Slovenia, Her Excellency Tanja Fajon, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs and European Affairs, to take the podium.
Thank you, Mr. President. These days we are marking the second anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and almost 10 years since the destabilization of the region has begun with the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula. The second and 10th anniversary are an opportunity to recap what the UN and its member states can do in order to stabilize the region and bring just and lasting peace to Ukraine. There have been many discussions about what can be done and what should be done in this respect. Allow me to present Slovenia's take in few points. 1. Peace. Peace should come to Ukraine. It may seem impossible at times, but it will happen. What we can do to expedite it is to support the peace process that is taking shape within Ukraine's peace formula. Russia needs to do its part. Russia must stop the aggression and immediately and unconditionally withdraw from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Its war rhetoric and threats need to cease. Another important step towards peace where we can aid Ukraine is to support global and regional initiatives aimed at providing a stable foothold for its reconstruction and environmental recovery. Slovenia is gravely concerned with existing environmental impacts of the war and is dreading potential ones. All of us can continue to support the EIEA and its efforts to prevent a nuclear accident in Ukraine. 2. International humanitarian law should and must be respected. With all the ruined homes, hospitals, and schools, and with civilian casualties on the rise for the consecutive months, this is obviously not the case. If lasting peace is to come to Ukraine, accountability needs to be assured. What we can do in this respect is to lay the groundwork for justice to be served in the future. We can support the strengthening of the international legal framework and assist in the establishment of the Special Tribunal on the crime of aggression against Ukraine. The recently signed Ljubljana, the Hague Convention, is an important complementary mechanism responding to violations by fighting impunity and promoting accountability for the most serious international crimes. And 3, the humanitarian situation should be addressed. We are witnessing the largest humanitarian crisis in Europe since World War II. An estimated 14.6 million Ukrainians will need humanitarian assistance in 2024. And we should take care that it reaches as many as possible, especially in light of increasing needs in other crisis areas around the world, such as Gaza. Slovenia will do its part. At the same time, 30% of Ukraine is contaminated with landmines, the highest percentage of any country in the world. We see humanitarian demining as a vital step towards normalization and economic recovery of the country. Mr. President, let me conclude with the following. There is no room for double standards. No one should ignore violations of international law, neither in Ukraine nor in Gaza. We will not allow undermining of international organizations. We will not allow undermining of our institutions. We demand respect for international humanitarian law and human rights law across the board by everyone, everywhere, and at all the time. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Slovenia, and I now invite Her Excellency Helena Carreras, the Minister of National Defense of Poland, no? Portugal, to take the floor.
President, I welcome the opportunity to address the General Assembly on the situation of the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. It has now been 10 years since Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and 2 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. More than 700 days of death and destruction have passed. More than 700 days of a war that has taken its toll on innocent civilians, with a disproportionate burden inflicted on women, children, and the elderly. More than 700 days of human suffering, death, injury, displacement, loss of critical infrastructure, reduced access to healthcare and education, and curtailment of human rights and fundamental freedoms. On this somber date, we cannot and will not fail to reiterate our resolute and unwavering condemnation of Russia's unprovoked, illegal, and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine, which constitutes a blatant violation of international law for which it must be held fully accountable. From the outset, Portugal has been unequivocal about where we stand, side by side with Ukraine in the defense of rules, principles, and values that should guide us all. Rules, principles, and values that are enshrined in the UN Charter. We are part of the overwhelming majority of this General Assembly, which has voted in favor of 6 resolutions condemning the invasion and calling for the end of Russia's war of aggression. Our support is comprehensive, be it on the political, financial, humanitarian, and also at the military level. We will continue to assist the brave Ukrainian armed forces in exercising its legitimate right to self-defense against an illegal aggression. We have welcomed nearly 6,000 refugees in Portugal while focusing on reconstruction efforts, such as in the case of the public school system of the Ukrainian city of Zhytomyr. But this discussion is not just about Ukraine. It is about upholding the respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. We cannot remain on the sidelines while the most fundamental principles of the international legal and security order are blatantly disregarded. None of us can feel safe until this war ends. This can only happen with a comprehensive and just solution that is in accordance with the UN Charter and in line with Ukraine's peace formula. But let us recall that any such solution cannot fail to consider the occupied territories of Crimea and Donbas since 2014. Allow me to be very clear. We do not recognize these illegal annexation attempts. Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson are part of Ukraine. The report of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, dated last October, gives us an appalling picture of the situation in terms of human rights and highlights the many cases of torture and violence, including sexual violence, perpetrated against civilians with a disproportionate impact on women, children, and older persons. That is why we support every action being taken by the International Criminal Court to hold accountable those responsible for these atrocities and to ensure justice for all the victims. Portugal also participates in the core group for accountability of Russia's aggression against Ukraine and support the Council of Europe's Register of Damage. The humanitarian crisis caused by this war has to end. President, when I visited Kyiv on February 2023, on the first anniversary of the Russian invasion, it was impossible to remain indifferent to the bravery of a people besieged by an unscrupulous aggressor. This bravery only found correspondence in the unshakable confidence of a nation determined to defeat a brutal and unjustified invasion. The remarkable resilience of Ukrainian men and women and their will to prevail are an inspiration to the world and a lesson to the aggressor. Yet, the impacts of this war are not confined to Europe. Russia's aggression has a direct effect on the global food, energy, and financial crisis, with severe impacts on the most vulnerable countries. The role of the UN Secretary General in mitigating these effects has proven invaluable. But this situation cannot be tolerated, and we will continue to support all collective efforts in this regard. We know that other pressing crises around the world require our attention and our action, but we need to be coherent, and therefore we cannot fail the people of Ukraine. So, together, united, we must remain unwavering in our support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished Minister of National Defense of Portugal. And I now invite His Excellency Buhar Usmani, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of North Macedonia, to take the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome the opportunity to address the General Assembly on this important occasion as we mark 2 years of Russia's full-scale invasion of its neighbor. 2 years, a war of aggression in Europe in the 21st century. 2 years of Russia's continued attempt to influence, interfere, and disrupt democracies and democratic processes across Europe, and 2 full years of death, destruction, and human suffering. Excellencies, I urge Russia once again to end this senseless war and withdraw its troops from the sovereign territory of Ukraine. Russia violated the basic principles of international law and UN Charter and launched a fully fledged war of aggression against Ukraine, a UN member state, and a peaceful neighbor. We condemn and reject the attempted illegal annexation by Russia of Ukraine's territories, as we have witnessed since 2014 with the occupation of Crimea and Sevastopol. Furthermore, Russia has committed a wide range of violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, which have been documented by international monitoring mechanisms alleging war crimes. North Macedonia is also strongly concerned and condemns Russia's unlawful deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia and Belarus, and calls upon them to ensure their safe return. Mr. President, the war of aggression against Ukraine stands in stark contrast to our shared commitment to peace, human rights, and fundamental freedoms, shaking security fundaments of Europe. This war has changed our way of life and challenged the very essence of the word freedom. Along with our strong condemnations of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, we concurrently condemn Russia's continuous attempts to interfere, influence, and disrupt democracies and democratic processes across Europe. While we are witnessing a full-scale war against Ukraine, in parallel, we are observing ongoing hybrid threats across Europe's regions and in Balkans also. The hybridity of Russia's hostile campaigns beyond Ukraine diverge from region to region, but the pattern and the anticipated end results are identical, generating instability and chaos. Russia, through its known hybrid means, is present in every societal pore. In North Macedonia and across our region, in the heart of Europe, we feel the adversity and the negative effects of this strategic influence. The security risks for Europe are imminent. It's clear, lingering threat to the whole of Europe, and we must say no to Russia's hostile campaign. Our response to this is defining our own future trajectory. Our response is clear: no to Russia, yes to Europe, strong, united, and integrated. Our shared no to Russia has to be loud, resolute, and consistent. It is our duty to expose Russia across the multilateral space and to keep insisting on moral, legal, and political accountability, to disarm and dismantle the system of disinformation and false narratives, to separate good from bad, truth from lies, right from wrong. Our country belongs and stands aside with the rest of the free world that believes in the ideals of peace, liberty, and democracy, fully aware and cognizant of the ultimate value and importance of these differences. North Macedonia is a functional multi-ethnic democracy resting on solid foundations. Our past and present speaks of a resilient society capable to withstand different trials and challenges. Mr. President, we must say no to Russia for the sake of the new generations, so they can live in peace, freed from fear of war and distrustful sense of insecurity, that the destiny of the Ukrainians could one day be their own. We reiterate the importance of investigating the war crimes on the territory of Ukraine, and North Macedonia will continue to engage in the work of the core group on options for the establishment of a tribunal on the crime of aggression against Ukraine. Excellencies, the discussion in this plenary is not only about Ukraine, but about each and every country present in the General Assembly. It is about respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states who rely on the norms and principles of international law and observe the Charter of the United Nations. It is about our shared democratic values and interests. It is about the sovereign rights of each state to choose its future. It is about the sovereign right of each state to defend itself against aggression. And the Russian Federation, a P5 member, violated these fundamental principles cherished by all and agreed upon by all. I call you to stand united and support Ukraine. Thank you so much.
I thank His Excellency, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of North Macedonia, and I now invite His Excellency Gordan Grilic Radman, the Minister of Foreign and European Affairs of Croatia, to take the podium.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. After 2 long and painful years, Russia is still conducting its brutal military aggression against Ukraine. Such flagrant breach of international law and the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter is an affront to the fundamental values of peace, security, and respect for the sovereignty of all nations. This aggression brings us to the brink of breaking the global system as a whole, endangering the ideas of freedom, sovereignty, and independence. We call on Russia to cease all combat operations and withdraw its troops from Ukraine. We regret the tremendous loss of all life resulting from Russia's senseless war and reaffirm our steadfast support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Mr. President, the much desired peace can only be lasting if it is just. For peace to be just, it has to be anchored in accountability. For this reason, accountability for crimes committed in Ukraine must be upheld, not only because it provides justice to the victims, but also because it helps prevent future atrocities. With this in mind, Croatia supports efforts to promote accountability for international crimes committed in and against Ukraine in all relevant multilateral fora, including the International Criminal Court and International Court of Justice. We have stood by Ukraine and its people from day one. We have provided aid, and over 25,000 Ukrainians have found temporary protection in Croatia. Croatia herself was a victim of aggression and has had war on her soil. Following our own painful experience, today we not only understand but strongly support and participate in all initiatives aimed at relieving the suffering of the Ukrainian population, especially the weakest and the most vulnerable ones. Besides the energy crisis, one of the most dramatic effects of the Russian aggression in the threat of food shortage looming over large parts of the world. Ukraine needs our collective support in its demining efforts. Croatia herself, with vast experience in demining her own territory, will remain committed to national and international actions in addressing the security and humanitarian concerns posed by these weapons and their indiscriminate use. Landmines in Ukraine are not just a Ukrainian or a European problem. Just like the current war, they have a global impact. Much of the world's most fertile land will remain contaminated by them for decades to come. In that regard, the global food supply, and with it our global security, will remain hindered and disrupted. In this vein, Croatia hosted the first ever high-level international donors conference on humanitarian demining in Ukraine in October 2023 in Zagreb. This conference, co-organized by the governments of Croatia and Ukraine, confirmed the support to Ukraine's demining efforts by 34 participating countries, pledging €500 million overall. Croatia will continue to support Ukraine. The aggression against Ukraine concerns us all in all corners of the world. Our collective efforts to achieve just and lasting peace in Ukraine must be redoubled. I assure you, Mr. President, of Croatia's unwavering commitment to this common task. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished Minister of Foreign and European Affairs of Croatia, and I now invite His Excellency Ignacio Cassi, the head of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland, to the podium.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. On the 24th of February 2022, 2 years ago, we woke up in Switzerland and across Europe to a nightmare. The distant spectre of war had suddenly materialized before our very eyes. All the precautions taken over 75 years to prevent a repetition of the tragedies of the 20th century suddenly seemed futile. Neither multilateralism nor public international law seemed capable of withstanding military force. After the initial shock and after the disbelief at such horrific images, we began to wonder, how was this possible? In the meantime, thousands of lives have been lost, millions of people have been displaced, and countless families have been torn apart by these tragic events. Today, I would like to reiterate our full solidarity with the Ukrainian people who are going through this catastrophe. It is certainly counterproductive to simply feel sorry for them or to feel powerless. I am firmly convinced that we must find the determination to act. in order to revitalize the tools at our disposal, with the aim of putting an end to the flagrant violations of international law and human rights. Here, ladies and gentlemen, here at the UN headquarters, we have a duty to respect the mandate given by this Assembly, to ensure that the peoples of nations have the right to live in peace. This means restoring peace and justice in Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, the road to peace is held in one hand. Our Charter. You can hold it in one hand. Sovereign equality between states, respect for territorial integrity, prohibition of the use of force. That's it. It's not more difficult than that. It's all there in this fundamental text, the guarantor of our universal values and of the multilateral order. This Assembly has always stayed the course. This was the case for the resolution in favour of a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine, adopted here on the 23rd of February last year by a large majority of us. And yet, we have to admit it, the Ukrainian horizon remains blocked, despite our unity in this room. On the road to peace, we have not yet found unity. Switzerland is determined to make its contribution to this, determined not only to contribute to peace, but also to protect civilians who are vulnerable to the devastating effects of war. We will relentlessly persevere in our commitment to ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions, which have been the pillars of international humanitarian law since 1864, and for which, as you know, Switzerland is the guarantor. Exactly 160 years ago, the first Convention on International Humanitarian Law was signed in Geneva, and exactly 75 years ago, the fourth Convention was signed. This anniversary should give us pause for thought. After 160 years, we still haven't really learned anything. Finding a realistic path to peace in Ukraine remains a key objective for my country. At Ukraine's request, we intend to organize by the summer a high-level conference on peace in Ukraine. I would therefore like to take this opportunity available to me today to invite all nations, all of you, from north to south, from east to west, invite you to work together towards our common goal, namely to find common ground for peace in Ukraine and to return to the path mapped out by the Charter. Ladies and gentlemen, let us remain united nations and not allow ourselves to be drawn into the spiral of military force or the temptation of power that transforms us into disunited powers. Thank you very much.
I thank the head of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland, and I now invite His Excellency Radoslaw Sikorski, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland, to the podium.
Excellencies, on the 21st of February 2022, 3 days before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Kenya's permanent representative to the UN, Ambassador Martin Kimani, spoke in the Security Council. In his short but remarkable speech, the ambassador talked about African countries' borders, inherited from the colonial empires, drawn with no regard for the existing nations and cultures. It certainly did not make life any easier for the inhabitants of those states. They could look backward and pursue racial, ethnic, or religious homogeneity and plunge into long-lasting conflicts. But they took a different path. Let me quote Ambassador Kimani. "We agreed that we would settle for the borders that we inherited, but we would still pursue continental, political, economic, and legal integration. We chose to follow the rules of the Organization of African Unity and the United Nations Charter, not because our borders satisfied us, but because we wanted something greater, forged in peace." End of quote. I remain grateful for these inspiring remarks. The courageous vision of the Kenyan ambassador contrasts starkly with the path chosen by the Russian Federation. Despite being a permanent Security Council member, Russia has repeatedly violated the UN Charter. It's trying to crush a sovereign state and exterminate its cultural identity. It shocked the world with brutality unseen for decades. We will never forget the atrocities committed in Bucha, Mariupol, or Kramatorsk. It decided to block the transport of grain and to use food as a weapon, even though the number of people suffering from hunger is growing at an alarming rate. Today, on the eve of the second anniversary of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Kremlin shows no intention to change the course, quite the reverse. The aggression resonates globally, causing economic turbulence that affects us all. 2 years ago, the General Assembly adopted the resolution condemning Russia's violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity. It demanded that Russia immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all of its military forces from Ukraine within the internationally recognized borders. 141 United Nations members stood up for Ukraine and against the breach of the international order. As we expressed our position clearly and reiterated it on several other occasions in the General Assembly, we committed ourselves to support the victim. We must fulfill this commitment. We must restore the world based on the principles of sovereignty of nations, inviolability of the borders, and respect for personal freedoms. We must hold the perpetrators and their accomplices accountable for their crimes. Only our resolve can deter the neo-imperial delusions that may arise in any part of the world. We need to stay the course until Mr. Putin understands that the days of European imperialism are gone for good. Thank you.
I thank the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland, and I now invite His Excellency David Cameron, Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs of the United Kingdom, to take the podium.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today, I want to cover 3 points. First, the history. 2 years ago, Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But let's go back a little further. In 2008, I visited Tbilisi in Georgia, shortly after Russian forces invaded South Ossetia. I said then that if we did not stand up to Putin, he would be back for more. In 2014, I was Prime Minister as his little green men seized control of Crimea. I said again that if we did not stand up to Putin, he would be back for more. Now, having tried and failed to conquer all of Ukraine, the lesson of this history is clear. If we do not stand up to Putin, he will be back for more. Compared to 2008 and 2014, I do believe the world has started properly to wake up to Putin's menace. Yet here is the tragedy of it all. Prior to 2014, did Ukraine pose a threat to Russia? No. Did Russia object to the formation of the Ukrainian state in 1991? No. Did it in 1994 when signing the Budapest Memorandum? No. In fact, Russia pledged never to use force against Ukraine. If the Ukrainian state was such a threat to Russian-speaking residents, why did every region of Ukraine vote for independence, Crimea and the Donbass included? Cut through ludicrous accusations of Nazism against a state with a Jewish president, and what are you left with? Nothing but the ahistorical claim that Ukraine's very existence is anti-Russian, a claim which runs contrary to the principle of self-determination, one of the foundations of the United Nations. Putin tries to claim that Russia is fighting not against Ukraine, but against the whole of the West. He claims we are somehow out to dismember Russia. That is the central lie of this war. The truth is that we, myself included, spent years trying to build a new relationship with Moscow after the end of the Cold War. We did that because we profoundly believe that a secure, stable Russia, at peace with its neighbors, is in our interests and the world's. It is a tragedy that Putin prefers to hark back to the 9th century to justify aggression rather than taking up this offer of a different path. And turning to the consequences of all this, the scenes in territories liberated from Russia defy belief. Take Bucha, as has just been said. Mutilated bodies of civilians with hands bound, shot at close range. A children's center turned into a torture chamber. The rape of teenage girls. Disturbing radio intercepts of Russian soldiers referring to this as cleansing. Or consider places still held by Russia. Business gone. Independent media quashed. The rights of minorities, such as the Crimean Tatars, denied. Sinister re-education centers. Forcible deportations, with children torn from their parents to be raised as Russians. Ukrainians forced to accept Russian passports or drafted to fight for Putin. Citizens forced to vote in sham referendums, and now, outrageously, Russian presidential elections held on Ukrainian territory. Crimea, in particular, now far more dependent on Moscow for budget support than it ever was to Kyiv. Invasion has brought these regions neither peace nor prosperity, and nor has Putin's gambit benefited Russians. No Russian soldier had died fighting Ukraine before 2014. Now they have suffered over 300,000 casualties. Moreover, since the invasion, Russia has suffered its first attempted coup in over 3 decades and its first debt default for over a century. Nor has the rest of the world been spared the consequences of this war. Rising energy and food costs have fueled inflation. This has had consequences, especially for the world's poorest. And this leads to my final point, why we must stay strong. 2 years on, I recognize some want to rethink. There is a sense of fatigue. There are other problems. A compromise might seem attractive. But this is wrong. We must recognize the cost of giving up. Putin has said there will be no peace until Russia's goals are achieved. And in his recent interview, he studiously avoided confirming he was satisfied with the land seized from Ukraine at present. This is not a man seeking compromise. Rather, this is a neo-imperialist bully who believes that might is right. And an unjust peace now merely invites a return to fighting in Ukraine when it suits him. But ultimately, we must stay strong, not only for the sake of Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine has been wronged. Yes, we admire their decision to pursue a democratic path and fight for their right to do so. But crucially, we also know that this matters to all of us. If Putin were to eke out some kind of win, the rest of the world would suffer too. What starts in Ukraine would not end there. Putin could easily apply his distortions of history elsewhere, such as Moldova or the Baltic states. and others will be emboldened to turn to fighting when it suits them. No country with a large aggressive neighbor would be safe. And that leads to the other great lie. Russia poses as a friend of those who feel cut out by the international system, but it has shown no interest in changes to make it fairer, such as Security Council reform. It does virtually nothing to support the key funds to back the poorest in our world, such as Gavi or the Global Fund, or IDA under the World Bank. And its actions in Ukraine are so brazen so as to threaten the system itself. So yes, we should stand by Ukraine, but not just for Ukraine, not just for Europe, but for the world, and a simple principle: the security of borders, the sanctity of nations, the principle of self-determination. Ukraine's fight is our fight, the world's fight, and the world must stay strong. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs of the United Kingdom, and I now invite His Excellency Gabrielius Landsbergis, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania, to take the podium.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, tomorrow we will mark 2 years since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In fact, Russia's aggression against Ukraine began a decade ago with Russia's occupation and illegal annexation of Crimea, the city of Sevastopol, as well as destabilization of Ukraine's Donbas region. We failed to stop Russia back then, and we can see where it brought us. Russia will not stop unless it is stopped. This genocidal war has many objectives: to erase Ukraine as a sovereign country and proud nation from European map, to threaten European security, and to undermine the rules-based international order. The impact of Russia's aggression reaches countries far beyond Ukrainian borders. We've seen how energy prices, food security, and migration are instrumentalized by Russia and its accomplice, Belarus. We've seen how Russia's disruption of Ukraine's exports through Black Sea ports impacted vulnerable populations globally. It is a global issue, not only a European war. If Russia is allowed to continue unabated in Ukraine today, its war will very soon creep into everyone else's backyard. Rogue players across the world will feel emboldened to settle their own issues their own way. Ukraine must receive all possible military, diplomatic, and economic support. Russia and Belarus must face isolation for their contempt for the very core principles on which the United Nations base their existence. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the most serious threat to the global peace and to the integrity of the entire UN system. If Russia is allowed to continue violating international law with no accountability, including for its crime of aggression, I do not see how we can still sit here in these halls and discuss other issues of today or the future. I do not know what would the future hold if we close our eyes before the genocidal assault by the Russian Federation on Ukrainian children, their illegal deportation to Russia and Belarus, their forced separation from families aimed at erasing their Ukrainian identity. As Russian troops continue attacking Ukraine in several directions, as we receive new and new evidence of Ukrainian war prisoners being executed by Russian occupying forces, as Russia organizes its presidential election in the territories of Ukraine occupied by it, Russian representatives continue exploiting and testing the limits of the international system, continue being elected to governing bodies and positions at the international organizations. That is not the way it should be. Colleagues, today's Russia is driven by revanchism and neocolonial expansionist instincts of the last unreconstructed empire. Kremlin is not interested in peace unless it can dictate its terms. If anyone still have doubts what Russia is capable of, the tragic fate of Alexei Navalny in a Russian prison serves as yet another sobering illustration of the ruthless suppression of dissent and of the alarming pace at which Russia continues its descent into totalitarianism. The body of Alexei must be released to his family without any further delay and any additional conditions. Russia must immediately halt its persecution of political figures, release political prisoners, and cease exploitation of the judicial system for political purposes. Kremlin, renowned for its persistent dissemination of a distorted historical narrative, has recently augmented its actions by including a number of Baltic and Polish officials into a so-called list of wanted criminals. These officials have become targets due to their outspoken opposition to Russia's historic revisionism. Russia must stop such activities. Ladies and gentlemen, Ukraine has proposed a clear path to peace, the 10-point peace formula. We urge all nations support this initiative and to not fall into the trap of the so-called peace plans that only aim Ukraine would succumb to the aggressor's agenda. Finally, let me express an honest hope that majority of nations gathered in this hall share the imperative to collectively uphold the principles enshrined in the UN Charter, reaffirming our unwavering commitment to the victory of the just and not the aggressor. An end to this war is possible, but genuine peace cannot be attained through the Russian deceit. The only real path to an enduring peace goes via Ukraine's victory and Russia's defeat. Thank you.
I thank the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania, and I now invite Her Excellency Annalena Baerbock, Federal Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany, to the podium.
I'm afraid the world will forget about us, because everyone is so focused on Russia's war and the violence in the Middle East. That's what a woman my age in Gorom in South Sudan told me. This woman has fled the violence in Sudan with only a small bag of belongings, carrying her child on her hip. Her words have not left me since. And I know that they ring true for countless women, children, and men around the world who go to bed hungry, who suffer violence. As I stand here, I say straight out, we have not forgotten about you. The fact that Russia's brutal war against Ukraine has been raging for 2 years does not mean that we do not see the suffering of others. A schoolgirl deported from the eastern territory of Ukraine, torn away from her mother, is a child who suffers. A toddler in Gaza who has lost his parents is a child who suffers. A boy in Sudan who is hungry is a child who suffers. Every life matters in equal measure. Humanity is indivisible. The worst thing we could do so now is to play off one person's pain against another's. We would only play into the hands of those who seek to divide us, to push their ruthless agenda in the world. That is why it is nothing but cynical when at the G20 meeting in Rio just 2 days ago, the Russian foreign minister openly asked why the world is so preoccupied with Russia's war against Ukraine. Well, Ms. Lavrov, we are preoccupied with your war because your war is causing death, pain, and destruction. Not just in Ukraine, not just in Bucha and Irpin in the eastern territories of Ukraine, but around the whole world. Russia has bombed ports in Ukraine on purpose to prevent Ukrainian grain from being exported to the world, using on purpose food as a weapon. And this could stop tomorrow if the Russian president were to end this war now. If you care about a world in which every life matters in equal measures, it is up to us and every one of us to stand up against Russia's war. The United Nations was founded for exact that purpose, to make sure alive is alive, that humanity is indivisible. President Putin has proved again and again that to him, human lives count for nothing, neither abroad nor at home, where he now doesn't even shy away from arresting its own children, Russian children, for laying down flowers to mourn the death of Alexei Navalny. As I explained to the women in South Sudan, we did not choose to be so preoccupied with Russia's war of aggression. It's the Russian president's ruthless actions that are forcing us. But that doesn't mean that we do not see the suffering in Sudan, that we don't see the suffering in the Middle East. Like many of you, the devastating humanitarian situation in Gaza is keeping us awake at night. 17,000 children left without a mother or a father. Hundreds of thousands desperate for food and water. This suffering needs to end now. We need Hamas to release all the men, women, and children it took hostage in its ruthless attack on Israel on October 7th. We need a humanitarian pause to work towards a sustainable ceasefire, to find a path towards a life in dignity, peace, and security for both Israelis and Palestinians in 2 states. I know that this conflict has stirred up intense emotions in many of our countries. That is why it's so important not to give in to those who try to play off one person's pain against another's. Political leadership means standing up to polarization, to protect our society from the poison of dehumanization. That is the message to send today here at our General Assembly. We stand with Ukraine as long as it takes, because we stand against a world of ruthlessness. We stand for a world in which alive is alive, whether Palestinian, Israeli, Sudanese, or Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the Federal Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany, and I now invite His Excellency Stéphane Séjourné, the Minister of European and Foreign Affairs of France, to the podium.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, ministers, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. For the past 2 years, Russia has been committing aggression against its neighbor, and for 2 years it has been inflicting the worst kind of suffering on its people. This war of aggression does not concern just Ukraine. It has very serious consequences for all of our populations. It has also been 2 years now that Russia has been exacerbating the food crisis. It has been consciously choosing to feed its war effort rather than help populations in need. It has been deliberately targeting and bombarding Ukraine's agricultural system on a daily basis. It has been purposely trying to block grain shipments via the Black Sea. The choice that Russia has made is therefore the choice to slow down and to deplete humanitarian aid. It is a choice to cause starvation. And let no one be fooled. The occasional shipment last summer of a few truckloads of aid will not compensate for the immense damage that has been caused, nor will it serve to put up a genuine fight against hunger in Africa and on other continents. To let Russia win is to let it destroy Ukrainian agriculture and steal Ukrainian land. It would mean to let hunger win. Russia is not helping the countries of the South. Russia is not helping the countries of the South, and certainly not their populations. On the contrary, and we must make this clear here today. Food insecurity is also linked to energy insecurity. For 2 years, Russia has been threatening energy supply, and of course, it has been doing so without the slightest regard for the fight against climate change. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is therefore something that concerns us all, and it also concerns us all because it is illegal and unjustified. The overwhelming majority of us in this assembly want international peace and security. This majority accounts for almost 3/4 of our assembly. And this majority is not silent. In 2 years, the General Assembly has called 6 times for respect for Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity, and for respect for the United Nations Charter. In October 2022, our Assembly also rightly condemned Russia's illegal occupation of entire regions of Ukraine. By attacking its neighbor, Russia is undermining the principles and rules that underpin the international order, of which we are all guarantors here in this room today. And no one wants a world in which these principles and rules are mere ink on paper, a world in which it is possible to invade one's neighbor with full impunity. So, Mr. President, 2 years on, it is time to see reason. It is time for this Russian aggression to finally end. We demand it, and this assembly has demanded it several times, as I have said. The International Court of Justice ordered it in March 2022, and I will be demanding it again on behalf of France this afternoon and the Security Council. To stand by Ukraine's side is to be on the side of law, the side of peace and security. It means being just and humane. As the President of the Republic had the opportunity to reiterate alongside President Zelensky during his recent visit to Paris, France stands and will continue to stand by Ukraine and its people. I thank you.
I thank the Minister for European and Foreign Affairs of France, and I now invite His Excellency José Manuel Álvarez Bueno, Minister of Foreign Affairs, European Union and Cooperation of Spain, to the podium.
President of the General Assembly, Ministers, and in particular Minister Kuleba, dear Dimitro, there are dates which stand out in history. There are dates which stand out in the soul of a people. Tomorrow, the 24th of February, will mark 2 years since the independence of the Ukrainian people was attacked, an attack that will fail in the light of the determination of a free people. 2 years of a cruel war that has had a terrible toll of pain and destruction, families torn apart and lives lost. 2 years of a senseless war, because no ambition can be above that of the peace and lives of millions of human beings. In the light of a war of aggression, silence is complicity. Not to speak up is to be against the victims. This assembly cannot remain silent, and our rejection of the aggression of Ukraine has been expressed in 4 resolutions approved by broad majorities of more than 140 votes in favour and less than 10 against. To accept that the will of one individual is allowed to bypass the international order would send a very negative signal to the rest of the world. It would be the very denial of the principles of the United Nations Charter. We would be resigning ourselves to might being right and opening up the world to a scenario of more conflicts, ever more violent conflicts. That is why today we reiterate our condemnation of the aggression of Russia against Ukraine. We condemn the continuous attacks against civilians, residential areas, hospitals and schools. Also, the criminal acts committed against civilians. To those that have committed these crimes, we will point them in the direction of the International Criminal Court. There can be no impunity. We are all outraged by the attack on Ukraine, but there are those that do more and do this facing danger. Attacks on Ukraine have also led to the death of volunteers and humanitarian workers. Last year, an indiscriminate attack cut short the life of a Spanish citizen, Emma Igual, who was protecting others. Those responsible for these and other atrocities must be brought to justice at the international. It must be brought to justice. Thinking of those, the victims, Spain has increased its financial support to the International Criminal Court. We've not only stepped up our mandatory contribution to the court to 7.5 million euros annually, but we've also made growing voluntary contributions. Last year, as part of a package of contributions to the Prosecutor's Office of the Court of 6 million euros, we earmarked 2 million euros to create a victim assistance program. Very many of us share the conviction that we need to act in defense of justice, but conviction has to be translated into a commitment if it is to be effective. That is what the government of Spain believes, as well as our European partners. The European Union has welcomed almost 10 million Ukrainian refugees. 200,000 of them have found a temporary home in Spain. We've also approved packages of humanitarian aid and equipment aid so that Ukraine is able to exercise its right to legitimate defense. The instability created by the attack on Ukraine has an undeniable global effect, which is threatening billions of people. An example of this is the food crisis. Russia has mined huge tracts of Ukraine, preventing that land from being used for farming. It's withdrawn from the Black Sea Grain Initiative. It's bombed ports and infrastructures for the transport of grain. We are seeing hunger being used on the most vulnerable countries as another weapon of war. We continue to work with Ukraine to ensure that grain can be shipped. We've consolidated a route through the Black Sea and reinforced our solidarity lanes. Spain has committed 236 million euros to fight food insecurity, 4.4 million for the Ukraine Grain Initiative and 2.5 million for the World Food Programme. Since the consequences of the aggression on Ukraine are global, the responses must also be global. The peace formula of President Zelensky establishes the foundation for peace. We would call upon all members of this Assembly to unite around this initiative that would put an end to a situation that requires the commitment on the part of everyone. We also celebrate the decision of the International Court of Justice to declare that it has the jurisdiction to hear allegations of genocide, and we demand that Russia comply with the precautionary measures issued by the court. We call for the immediate withdrawal of its troops from all of Ukrainian territory. The aggression against Ukraine must not be allowed to last one day longer. Today, we are here to remember that terrible day, the 24th of February. We're here defending peace and the principles of the United Nations Charter. And we will continue alongside Ukraine until we can meet here once again in the same assembly, not to mark the first day of a cruel war, but to celebrate its last day and the beginning of a just peace for a free Ukraine. Thank you very much.
I thank the Minister of Foreign Affairs, European Union and Cooperation of Spain, and I now invite Her Excellency Hanke Gerdina Johannet Bruinslot, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of Netherlands, to the podium.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, there's a picture that I would like to show here today, but I cannot. The photo is of a man whose name I would like to mention here today, but I cannot. because it would put him in danger. And so, today, I will call him Andrei. He's a commander in the Ukrainian army, a young father with a family. For 2 years, he's been fighting for the peace and security of its own country. For 2 years, he has barely seen his family. Because Andrei does not allow himself a moment rest. He's prioritizing his children's future over the precious moments he would love to spend with them now. It's the most impressive encounter that I have had as a Minister of Foreign Affairs. Not for a moment, not for a second, does he allow himself to lose focus, to feel doubt, or simply to recharge. Not for a moment does he allow himself to think even about giving up. It's his strength, this resilience that I see in the eyes of all the Ukrainians I meet. It is truly remarkable how the people of Ukraine have been able to withstand Russia's aggression for so long. Mr. President, in the same theme, we must continue to support Ukraine. At the same time, of course, our attention and action are required in so many other places. The conflict between Israel and Hamas, resulting in so many innocent victims, the grim tragedy unfolding in Sudan, and the misery in so many other places in the world. Violence that is driving communities to despair, violence that must be stopped. And that's precisely why we can't allow our gaze to shift away from Ukraine. Not only because Russia is slowly destroying Ukraine, but because Russia's war on Ukraine is an assault on the world, on the principle of sovereignty that we all stand for, on the UN Charter that we all signed, on the rules-based order that we all value. And so it is in our interest for Ukraine to withstand Russia's aggression, for it to stop Russia's aggression. And that's why we must support Ukraine, not half-heartedly, not temporarily. We must do whatever it takes for as long as it takes, because there can be no lasting security without recovery, and there can be no lasting peace without justice. Indeed, the only viable end to war is a just peace, and that's why we support Ukraine's Zelensky's peace formula. And it's why we're taking the lead in restoring justice for Ukraine. It is in our common interest to hold the perpetrators of this war to account, because there can never be peace without justice for the victims. Mr. President, over the past 2 years, we have all seen how food prices have skyrocketed, how energy prices have soared, and how hunger has increased in some of the world's most vulnerable places. This senseless war of choice needs to stop for all our sakes. My hope is vested in collaboration that endures, even when times are tough, because in an increasingly polarized world, such collaboration can help us reach shared goals. And so my hope is vested in us, everyone gathered here in this esteemed assembly. While our perspectives may vary, sometimes even radically, we all want to forge a tomorrow that is a safer, more stable, and more prosperous than it is now. Not a tomorrow where might is right, but a legacy we all want for our children. In the spirit of Andrei, we must prioritize the future of our world, the future of our children over our differences, and so we must support Ukraine. We must do whatever it takes for as long as it takes. Thank you.
I thank the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and I now invite Her Excellency Linda Thomas-Greenfield, Member of Cabinet of the President of the United States and a permanent representative to the United Nations, to the podium.
Good morning. I want to start by thanking Ukraine and the PGA for organizing this critically important debate. If you walk out of this hall towards the Security Council, you will pass by two pieces of Ukrainian art, a vase and a carpet, each depicting a tree in blossom. Secretary General Yuthant spoke at the dedication ceremony for the gifts, highlighting their original symbolic meaning, to protect life. Whenever I pass by this art, I'm reminded of the fight before the Ukrainian people to protect life and protect their way of life. Colleagues, it's been 2 years since Russia launched its illegal, unprovoked, and brutal full-scale invasion of Ukraine. An invasion that culminated a 10-year effort to occupy Ukraine's land and subjugate its people. In the time since, we've seen Russian forces commit unspeakable brutality and crimes against humanity, and we've watched in real time as the Kremlin sought to rewrite history. Through torture and deportation, re-education and indoctrination, repression and disinformation, Russia has tried to deny Ukrainian identity, to stifle dissent, to rationalize the unconscionable. But we know the truth. We know the truth. This is not a war of liberation. This is not a war of Russian self-defense. This is not a war of last resort. It never has been. And it certainly isn't today. Colleagues, this is a moment for somber remembrance, and it is an opportunity to reaffirm our support for the principles of the United Nations Charter and for the people of Ukraine. Not in spite of the fact that so many are suffering elsewhere, but because the fight for security, for humanity, for self-determination is universal. Ukrainians have shown us what it means to fight for those values every day against the steepest of odds. And so we owed it to them to tell the story Russia so desperately wishes to hide. Stories of religious leaders detained or murdered for daring to pray for their country, of journalists, dissidents, and political activists targeted and tortured, but continuing to sound the alarm, of communities whose churches were seized, their streets stripped of their Ukrainian names, their residents required to obtain Russian passports to receive basic services, of hundreds of men, women, and children executed by Russian soldiers in Bucha, their children's camp converted into a torture chamber, their bodies tossed into mass graves, and of thousands and thousands of children ripped from their families and relocated into Russia. Children like Margarita, a 10-month-old Ukrainian baby who was taken from Kherson Children's Hospital and is still being held by a Putin ally. Through it all, the Ukrainian people have embodied the spirit that artwork outside the council shows: to protect life, to protect life. Ordinary, extraordinary people, vastly outnumbered, fiercely defending their communities, teachers transforming bunkers into classrooms, city workers finding ways to restore heat and electricity after bombardments, families rationing food to feed their neighbors. Their unbreakable spirit must be a model for all of us, because this war, this brazen violation of the UN Charter, affects all of us. Russia's attack on Ukrainian agricultural infrastructure have exacerbated food insecurity across the globe. Russia's use of energy exports as a coercive tool have caused volatility in global markets. Russia's destruction of land, water, and air have damaged the environment of the entire Black Sea region. And Russia's procurement of munitions from the DPRK, including ballistic missiles and launchers, has undermined the global nonproliferation regime. As a global community, we have come together before to condemn Russia's violations of the UN Charter and reject its illegal attempts to seize Ukrainian territory. We have found ways around Russia's war on the world's food supply. And we have chosen diplomacy and dialogue, even as Russia has elected for destruction and disorder. But just as Putin is hoping Ukrainian resolve will fade, he is counting on ours to dissipate as well. And so the task before us is clear. 10 years since this campaign began, and 2 years since Russia's full-scale invasion, we must continue to stand with Ukraine and stand up for international order. And here's what that looks like. First, we must resist the false choices and equivalencies that Russia continues to throw at us in an attempt to divide us. The false notion that Ukraine bears equal responsibility for beginning the war and equal power to end it, when we know this conflict was started and this conflict wages on because of one small man. The false notion that we must agree on everything in order to do anything, and the false notion that tackling this challenge means ignoring other ones. Colleagues, I know that Hamas's terrorist attack on October 7th and all of the devastation that has come after it have rightly been a focus of global attention and concern. And though many of us share a common goal of reaching a durable peace, I've heard from people, including many of you, who have real disagreements with how we create that peace. But to be clear, our care for one people does not in any way negate the care for another. Compassion is not a zero-sum game. Defending peace and security is not zero-sum. And any insinuation otherwise is in and of itself a false choice. And so as we continue to work around the clock to find the best course of action in the Middle East, we cannot lose sight of Russia's brutality in Ukraine. And we cannot forget the plight of Ukrainians who are still fighting and dying for their freedom. Which brings me to my next point. We must speak in a unified voice to demand Russia end this war. That means calling for Russia to withdraw its forces from Ukraine's internationally recognized borders, and uphold the basic principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. It means calling on states like Iran and the DPRK to end their military support for an illegal aggression. And it means ensuring we bring justice to victims of Russia's horrific crimes, because behind every statistic is a person with a story. And that brings me to my final point. We must not grow numb to the plight of the Ukrainian people. There's a phrase I've heard tossed around recently, Ukraine fatigue. The idea that years into this war, our support and attention are faltering. And yet I cannot imagine explaining that we're tired to the people I met in Ukraine, to the woman who'd been raped by Russian soldiers and had no joy on her face, to the medical workers detained and tortured by Russian forces for weeks. And to the 10-year-old, who more than anything simply wanted to go back to school and see her friends. The mother who lost her child in an attack on her home, who held her baby in her arms as she died. Colleagues, those Ukrainians, those families who cannot afford to be fatigued are counting on us to defend the United Nations Charter and hold those who violate it to account, to resist division and fatigue, to come together, to push for diplomacy, for dialogue, and for a just, durable peace, to protect life so that freedom and democracy can once again bloom in Ukraine and everywhere that is under attack. That was our charge when we gathered 2 years ago, and that is our charge today. So please, let us not falter or fail. Thank you.
I thank the member of the Cabinet of the President of the United States and permanent representative to the United Nations. And I now invite Her Excellency Lisbeth Zilmer-Johns, the State Secretary for Foreign Policy of Denmark, to the podium, speaking on behalf of the Nordic countries.
President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed an honor to address the United Nations General Assembly on behalf of the 5 Nordic countries, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Denmark. Today marks 2 years of Ukrainians defending themselves against Russia's full-scale invasion. This month also marks 10 years since the start of Russia's war of aggression and illegal annexation of Crimea. Russia, a nuclear power and a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, is waging a war on its free and independent neighboring country, Ukraine, in brutal violation of the United Nations Charter. The war is an attack on democracy and a flagrant violation of international law, and it has created far-reaching and devastating global consequences, such as the food and energy crisis. We must all stand with Ukraine to change this course. President, Ukraine and its people have shown incredible resilience and determination during 10 years of Russia's aggression. The war has caused immense suffering for Ukrainians, especially children and other persons in vulnerable situations. Russia's airstrikes have repeatedly targeted civilians and critical infrastructure. Millions of people have been displaced, either within Ukraine or to somewhere far away from their home country. We are appalled by the devastating consequences and the still deteriorating humanitarian situation. In the temporarily occupied territories, we see numerous reports of sexual violence and torture against civilians, and the forced transfer or unlawful deportation of persons, including children, out of Ukraine. We must ensure that international crimes are investigated and perpetrators held to account. Ukraine and Ukrainians continue to pay a high price for Russia's aggression. The reconstruction of Ukraine has started. It will take years to build back what has been destroyed. We are committed to supporting Ukraine in these endeavors. President, exactly a year ago, the General Assembly adopted a resolution on the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, underlying a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. All the Nordic countries supported this resolution, together with an overwhelming majority of the United Nations member states. For us Nordics, the choice was clear. We are strong defenders of international law, including international humanitarian law. Flagrant violations of international humanitarian law, attacks on civilians and civilian objects, and impunity for war crimes cannot be tolerated. We continue to stand up against all violations of international law wherever they occur. Mr. President, The Nordics support President Zelensky's peace formula and a peace summit based on Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity in line with the UN Charter. We share the view that Ukraine alone shall define the prerequisites for peace. But Ukraine cannot achieve the peace it deserves alone. Therefore, it is of utmost importance that we ensure the broadest possible international support for Ukraine's peace formula. This is not an isolated war. It has clear regional and global consequences. President, the Nordic countries continue to call on Russia to immediately stop its illegal war of aggression, withdraw all its forces, and respect Ukraine's independence and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We must hold Russia accountable for its actions. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished State Secretary for Foreign Policy of Denmark. And now I give the floor to the distinguished His Excellency Nicolas Marche, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Austria.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we gather today to mark a dark and somber anniversary. Almost 2 years have passed since Russia launched its war of aggression, unprovoked and unjustifiable, against its neighbor Ukraine. 2 years of Russian attacks on Ukrainian civilians and infrastructure, 2 years of human suffering, millions of lives uprooted and livelihoods destroyed, and 2 years of global consequences of this war, including Russia holding global food supply chains hostage for its cynical political ambitions, thereby displaying utter disregard for the plight of the people living in the world's poorest and most vulnerable countries. Today's debate is also a reminder that this war did not only start in February 22. 10 years ago, Russia illegally occupied and annexed Crimea. As members of a global order founded on international law, we cannot accept to live in a world where the law of the powerful overrides the rule of law. As a neutral country, Austria particularly relies on the respect and implementation of international law, treaties, and customs for its security. None of us can afford to stand idly by while the fundamental principles of our shared legal and security order are violated, not in Ukraine and not anywhere in the world. On top of Russia's illegal occupation of whole regions of Ukraine, the civilian population has been subjected to massive attacks, war crimes, crimes against humanity. Ukrainian cities such as Bucha and Mariupol have become synonymous for unspeakable human suffering. Russia has reportedly deported thousands of Ukrainian children to the occupied territories or to Russia. We must do everything in our power to bring these children back to their homes and families. We must be clear that there can be no sustainable peace without justice and accountability. Crimes cannot go unpunished. We fully support all efforts to ensure accountability, including by the International Criminal Court and the UN Commission of Inquiry based in Vienna. Mr. President, Austria stands in full solidarity with Ukraine, the Ukrainian government, and the Ukrainian people. The humanitarian consequences of Russia's war and its impact on the civilian population and on the environment cannot be overstated. As part of our humanitarian efforts, we have welcomed Ukrainian refugees in Austria. Since February 22, over 100,000 refugees have been registered. More than 70,000 are currently residing in Austria, and over 13,000 Ukrainian children are currently being schooled in Austrian schools. Moreover, Austria has so far provided over 200 million euros in bilateral humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and its neighboring countries. In addition, 1/3 of the Ukrainian territory may have been contaminated, but with mines and unexploded weapons. Therefore, we have provided more than 7 million euro for demining efforts in Ukraine. Furthermore, we have to continue to help Ukraine export its grain to those countries who need it most around the globe. Many measures are in place: solidarity lanes, reinforcement of river ports, as well as other multilateral efforts together with our partners, like the Grain from Ukraine initiative. Ladies and gentlemen, nuclear risks are higher today than they have been in decades. We welcome efforts by the international community to work together, foremost through the IAEA in Vienna and on the ground, to secure the nuclear energy facilities that have become targets in the war. We welcome the tireless work of the IAEA teams in all nuclear power plants in Ukraine, and in particular in Zaporizhzhia. All this underscores the utmost urgency of progress on nuclear disarmament and of moving away from the nuclear deterrence paradigm. Mr. President, my final point. The United Nations and other multilateral organizations, such as the OSCE in Vienna, are indispensable fora in which member states can address and hopefully resolve their disputes in an inclusive dialogue setting. In these troubled times, we need more multilateralism and more dialogue, not less of it. This entails also talking to those we do not agree with. We must preserve and strengthen these organizations and enable them to fulfill their role. Exactly 1 year ago, at this assembly, an overwhelming majority of 141 states called on Russia to stop this war, to stop the suffering, to stop the nuclear threats, and to stop the blatant breaches of the UN Charter. From around the world, we have heard consistent calls for peace. No country longs for peace more than Ukraine, a lasting peace that is comprehensive, just, and based on the UN Charter and international law, just as this assembly demanded 1 year ago. This is why Austria supports the peace formula presented by Ukraine, as well as a broad-based peace summit on the basis of this formula at the right point in time. This peace has yet to become reality. It is in the Kremlin's power to stop this war immediately. Once again, we therefore call on Russia to stop its aggression, to withdraw its troops from the entire territory of Ukraine, and to end the bloodshed. I thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Austria. And now I give the floor to the distinguished Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Romania, His Excellency Traian Hristia.
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, as we mark 2 years since the beginning of the Russian Federation's fully fledged war of aggression against Ukraine, we continue to see a disturbing level of hostilities with no sign of abatement, with unimaginable sufferings for the civilian population and dire, long-lasting consequences. It is important to underline here at the United Nations that this continued aggression undermines the core of the rules-based international order and effective multilateralism, and remains a matter of concern for the entire international community. However, Russian Federation's aggression did not start with the war it launched on 24th of February 2022, but with the illegal annexation of Crimean Peninsula back in 2014. This is the main reason for which we must continue firmly condemning at the United Nations the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. The support of the international community is critical during these difficult times, and I would like here to echo the statement of His Excellency Deputy Prime Minister of Luxembourg. Ukraine remains very important for the global community for reasons concerning not only the respect for the United Nations Charter and the international law, including the humanitarian law, but also for the very serious and concrete impact that the Russian Federation aggression has on various fields at global level, and I will limit myself to name the dramatic aggravation of the food insecurity which affects the most vulnerable countries and populations. Romania will continue to support Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We condemn in the strongest possible terms the so-called referenda organized by Russian Federation in the occupied territories of Ukraine. These actions are illegal and illegitimate, a grave breach of fundamental principles of international law, and another flagrant violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Reports coming from Crimea and other temporarily occupied regions are disturbing, showing many instances of politically motivated violence, imprisonment, and torture. All crimes must be duly investigated, and those responsible must be held accountable. Russia must be held responsible for its wrongful and unlawful conduct. The world has to send a clear message. There is no justification for bloodshed, destruction, and human suffering. Therefore, we need the full force and legitimacy of the General Assembly to reaffirm with full determination that international law matters, that the United Charter matters, and that we stand by the rules put in place for the protection of every single member state of this organization. Romania will continue to be a trustful, credible, and involved multilateral partner. From day one of this war, the government and population of Romania acted as first responders in providing help to the Ukrainians that sought shelter in our country. Also, we continue to commit to supporting global efforts on food security, facilitating so far the transit of more than 34 million tons of Ukrainian grains. The ongoing war in Ukraine has a major impact in the region, challenging the resilience of neighboring states. We have extended a helping hand to our neighbor, the Republic of Moldova, the country most affected by war except Ukraine itself. Mr. President, we have to work together to bring peace back to its deserving place. Romania fully supports the Ukrainian peace formula as the single framework conducive to a fair, lasting, and sustainable peace based on the principles of the UN Charter we have stood up for in the past. And one principle is clear, legally and morally. Ukraine alone has the political and moral legitimacy to decide if, when, and on what terms it wants to engage with the Russian Federation. Our call is clear. Russia must abide by the rules of international law. It must unconditionally cease the use of force and withdraw completely and immediately from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Romania warmly praises the resilience and courage of the Ukrainian people who heroically resisted through the last past years, and we will continue to stand by Ukraine. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Romania. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Kyoto Tsuji, State Minister of Foreign Affairs of Japan.
Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, the UN Charter is a common agreement which all member states must observe in good faith. It's the foundation of all international relations. For this very reason, we cannot condone Russia's ongoing aggression against Ukraine. This General Assembly has repeatedly stated that Russia's aggression is a clear violation of international law, including the Charter. Unilateral change of the status quo by force is never acceptable anywhere in the world. There's no country that does not want peace in Ukraine. However, peace cannot reward the aggressor. It must be comprehensive, just, and lasting, based on the purposes and principles of the Charter. We, the member states, affirmed this 1 year ago in this hall. Nevertheless, the people of Ukraine continue to suffer from Russia's unprovoked aggression. Russia must be held accountable for all its atrocities. Other UN member states must also refrain from supporting the aggression, either directly or indirectly. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, the people of Ukraine also need a hopeful vision for their future. Last November, I led an economic mission to Kyiv to promote Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction. We discussed concrete measures with Prime Minister Shmyhal and the business community and promised to accelerate these efforts. On February 19th, we invited Prime Minister Shmyhal to Japan and held the Japan-Ukraine Conference for Promotion of Economic Growth and Reconstruction in Tokyo. Tangible results were achieved, including the signing of more than 50 cooperation documents. In addition, we concluded the new tax convention on part of the development of a legal infrastructure. Japan also decided to introduce measures to relax the multi-entry visa requirement for Ukrainians involved in Japan-Ukrainian cooperation projects. We would like to highlight that during the conference, we held a session on women, peace, and security, what we call WPS, with the aim of promoting discussions on how to incorporate a WPS perspective into the process of recovery and reconstruction in Ukraine. This session also affirmed our commitment to the protection of women, including through healthcare, shelter development, and protection of victims of gender-based violence. Women and children, particularly those made vulnerable by conflict, must be protected. Japan will continue to take the lead in promoting WPS at the UN as well. By holding this conference, we demonstrated our unwavering commitment to supporting Ukraine. Japan will continue to lead international efforts to support Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, these initiatives, however, will not fully materialize and bring sufficient benefit to the Ukrainian people unless Russia stops its aggression. We must continue our efforts to maintain and strengthen the international order based on the rule of law and realize a safe and secure world where human dignity is protected. Japan is determined to play a leading role to strengthen the functions of the UN, including through reform of the Security Council to enable it to fulfill its primary role. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, I'd like to pay my heartfelt compliments to Foreign Minister Kleba and to the people of Ukraine who continue their efforts to restore peace. Japan will stand with Ukraine until peace and justice prevail. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency State Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Jan Marian, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Czechia.
Mr. President, Excellencies, colleagues, exactly 10 years ago, Russia started an unprovoked war of aggression against its neighbor. 8 years later, escalated Russia its illegal aggression against Ukraine even further by launching a full-scale invasion. This unprecedented attack by a permanent member of the Security Council has had far-reaching consequences. By violating the fundamental rights of Ukraine to independence, sovereignty and integrity, territorial integrity, Russia is putting peace and security at risk globally. In conducting its war of aggression, Russia has repeatedly targeted civilians and civilian infrastructure. UN investigations have confirmed Russia's responsibility for gross violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. Bucha and Irpin became tragic symbols of this brutality. Mr. President, these violations of international law have been accompanied by other means of warfare, such as the Russian attempts to block the export of grain from Ukraine. Energy blackmailing by Russia resulted in soaring prices of energy, thus fueling inflation globally. As a result, Russia took all of us hostages of its aggressive imperialistic policy. Mr. President, now that Ukraine is entering the third year of a massive land, air, sea and information war, we often hear that peace should be reached through diplomatic means and negotiations. But let us be clear, there is one state that can end this war immediately, today. To that end, we reiterate our call on Russia to cease its unlawful aggression and to withdraw completely and from the whole territory of Ukraine. Under no circumstances should the aggressor behavior be rewarded by doubtful compromises enforced through peer pressure or military threats. It is only up to Ukraine to define what a durable and just peace should look like. Czechia, as well as more than 80 other countries from all over the world, is actively participating in the peace formula process outlined by President Zelensky. We consider this peace proposal as the only viable and legitimate. At a massive cost, Ukrainian people have defended their country and their sovereignty. They count on us, the international community, to do our part. From our side, there is no doubt Czechia will proudly stand by Ukraine until it prevails in its just fight and the aggressor is held accountable. Mr. President, as we speak, Russia, with its war of aggression, continues to violate not only the United Nations Charter, but the very purpose the UN was set up for, the maintenance of peace. We must not allow Russia's challenge to the rule-based international order, in which might trumps right, and fundamental values are blatantly violated. If we do so, we will create space for similar aggressive behavior elsewhere in the world. This is why we all have a stake in Ukraine prevailing as a sovereign nation within its internationally recognized borders. The world needs to take a clear and firm position that such aggression is not acceptable. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Czechia. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Sean Fleming, Minister of State for International Development and Diaspora of Ireland.
President, today we mark the second anniversary of Russia's unprovoked and unjustified invasion of Ukraine. Russia has needlessly taken many thousands of lives, both Russian and Ukrainian, and forced 14 million people from their homes. For those who have remained, Russia's indiscriminate attack on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure continues. Russia is kidnapping and deporting thousands of Ukrainian children, robbing them of their families and their identities. This brutality is deliberate and calculated. It is designed to break the spirit of the Ukrainian people. Make no mistake, Russia's actions are a threat to each and every one of us and to the foundations of the international rules-based system upon which the United Nations is built. That is why Ireland, the European Union, and so many UN member states present here today have taken decisive action in response to Russia's aggression. We will continue to do whatever it takes because we understand what is at stake, not just for Ukraine or for Europe, but for the global community of nations. The global community has responded to Russia. On 6 occasions in the 11th emergency session, this body strongly endorsed resolutions that reaffirmed a global commitment to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. This body has demanded the immediate, complete and unconditional withdrawal of Russian military personnel from Ukrainian territory. Russia refuses to implement every resolution adopted so far. Our economic and humanitarian support for Ukraine, our hosting of Ukrainian refugees, and our initiatives to ensure accountability for Russia's violations of international law are an integral part of our response. Communities across Ireland and Europe have been playing their part in this effort, demonstrating compassion and support for Ukrainian struggle by providing safe refuge to those fleeing their homes. The Irish people have welcomed 105,000 Ukrainians into our communities, which amounts to over 2% of the population of our state. The historic decision by the European Council to open a accession negotiation with Ukraine was a strong signal to the Ukrainian people that Ukraine belongs within the European family in that global community of nations. It is also a clear signal to Russia that we will continue to stand with Ukraine for the long term. President, Ireland was shocked and outraged at the death of Alexei Navalny in a Russian prison last week. His incarceration and death once again demonstrates the Russian government's contempt for democratic values and human rights. It also reminds us why the Ukrainian people have no wish to be governed by Russia. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has severely disrupted global food and energy markets, affecting the world's most vulnerable people. Russia makes a pretense of supporting the most vulnerable, but Russia is only interested in imposing Moscow's will. We saw this clearly through Russia's inexcusable decision to unilaterally withdraw from the Black Sea Grain Initiative, compounding an already critical situation on world food markets. Ukraine, on the other hand, is working to contribute to global food safety and security. Ukraine and EU partners have managed to stabilise food prices and help feed the world's hungry through the European Solidarity Lanes, the Black Sea Humanitarian Corridor and the Grain from Europe initiative. Ireland is a small, militarily neutral country, dependent on global trade and stable relations between nations grounded in diplomacy. The multilateral system remains our strongest protection and our most important global security asset. We rely on this system for our very existence as a sovereign democratic nation. Russia's war of aggression challenges this to its very core. If we allow Russia to prevail in Ukraine, they will be encouraged to pursue their imperialist agenda against others, and we will all suffer the consequences. As Ukraine defends their nation, Ukrainians are also defending our fundamental freedoms, the right to live peacefully within their own borders without fear of being attacked. Under President Zelensky's peace formula, Ukraine is working towards that right we all claim, to determine our own future in peace and security, in line with the UN Charter and international law. Ukraine deserves the unqualified support of every single member state of this global community, these United Nations. Ireland pledges our unwavering support today and always. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Minister of State for International Development and Diaspora of Ireland. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Rainis Bruce Bardis, Parliamentary Secretary, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Latvia.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the 24th of February 2022 will forever be recalled as the day when Russia started its unprovoked and illegal invasion of peaceful Ukraine. 2 years on, Russia's brutal war of aggression continues to bring immense pain and suffering to people of Ukraine. Russia, a permanent member of United Nations Security Council, is violating international law and the United Nations Charter by invading a sovereign neighboring country. It's a shameful attack against the rules-based international order. We as an international community must be resolute and stand against such an attack. This General Assembly has overwhelmingly condemned Russia's unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine and attempted illegal annexation of Ukrainian regions. Furthermore, the impact of this senseless war is felt globally, and as the food crisis elevates, Russia must be stopped, and it is in all our interests. Mr. President, it is vital that the international community continues to provide all necessary support to Ukraine. Latvia stands together with Ukraine and strongly believes in its victory. Temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine and the people therein are not forgotten. These territories and Ukrainians in them are an integral part of Ukraine. Donetsk, Kherson, Lugansk and Zaporozhye regions, along with the Crimea and Sevastopol, are and will remain Ukraine. We call upon Russia to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all of its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its international recognized borders. Meanwhile, Russia is undertaking efforts to wipe out Ukrainian culture and identity in the temporarily occupied territories. Horrific crimes that Russia has committed in Ukraine remind of the bitter experience of Latvian people during the Soviet occupation. Filtration camps, forceful deportation of civilians, forced mobilization, illegal detention and prosecution, execution outside courts, illegal adoption of children, and forced passportization are from the same playbook. Russia continues to deny its committed crimes, seeks to justify its illegal invasion, and blames anyone but itself for it. War crimes committed by Russia cannot go unpunished, and accountability must be ensured. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Parliamentary Secretary, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Latvia. And now I give the floor to Her Excellency, Lauri Tiarala, State Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Finland.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, first, we align ourselves with the joint Nordic statement presented by Denmark. Mr. President, tomorrow, 2 years have passed since Russia began its illegal, full-scale war of aggression in Ukraine. For 2 years, we have witnessed Russia's unprovoked invasion. At the same time, Ukrainians have shown their incredible resilience, actually starting already 10 years ago with the illegal annexation of Crimea and the following war in eastern Ukraine. Today, tremendous human suffering continues in Ukraine. Our thoughts are with the brave people of Ukraine who are defending their families, their freedom, and their country. Our thoughts are especially with the children forcefully deported by Russia and their families. We will continue to speak for them and others who are suffering from the consequences of Russia's brutal war. Mr. President, Russia's illegal war is not only a European problem. It is not only a Western problem, and it is not only a problem of rich countries. It has immense global consequences, especially in the field of food and energy. This needs to stop. Mr. President, Ukraine deserves a just and lasting peace based on the UN Charter. Therefore, Finland participates in the implementation of President Zelensky's peace formula. It is the only serious and viable plan to secure a peaceful future for Ukraine. Broad international support and engagement is essential as we build up to the upcoming peace summit. All of our efforts can make a difference. Ukraine has immediate needs to which we must respond now, but obviously that is not enough. The Ukrainians will need our extensive support also in the long term. The reconstruction efforts will be immense, and they have fortunately already started. Finland is firmly committed to contributing to the reconstruction of Ukraine in the coming years. Mr. President, Russia must immediately end its brutal and illegal invasion of Ukraine. We, once again, call on Russia to respect the independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Finland continues to condemn Russia's blatant violations of human rights, international humanitarian law, and the UN Charter. Finland continues to stand with Ukraine as long as it takes. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency State Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Finland. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Dasha Darsalia, First Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Georgia.
Mr. President, Excellencies, it has been 2 years since Russia unleashed its war of aggression against Ukraine. This aggressive policy and illegal attempts to forcefully redraw the borders of the sovereign neighbors have been assaulted on the international rules-based order, blatant violation of the principles of UN Charter, the Helsinki Final Act, and the Charter of Paris, and have shattered security architecture in Europe and beyond. Implications of this war go beyond national boundaries and exacerbate already massive scale of global challenges. The past 2 years of war have entailed humanitarian consequences and destruction of immense scale. Russian tactics of targeted attacks on civilian objects and infrastructure with high casualties among the civilian population of Ukraine is unacceptable. Distinguished delegates, up to this day, Russia continues illegal occupation of my country's Abkhazia and Tkhinvali regions. Therefore, security environment in and around Georgia is further deteriorating. Besides, the human rights situation on the ground remains dire. Russian occupation continues to take a heavy toll on innocent civilians and has recently claimed lives of several Georgian citizens. It remains alarming that despite the grave situation in both occupied regions of Georgia, the access of international human rights mechanisms is continuously denied by Russia, the power exercising effective control on the ground, as it has been confirmed by the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights. Distinguished delegates, along with the international community, Georgia has been demonstrating full solidarity to Ukraine with political and diplomatic steps, as well as providing substantial humanitarian assistance. Georgia has supported all the resolutions and initiatives made by all major international organizations in support of Ukraine. Allow me to reiterate Georgia's fierce support to the peace initiatives of Ukraine, the key points of which are based on the Charter and therefore go beyond the restoration of peace and territorial integrity of Ukraine, having overarching aim of defending the core values of the United Nations. Georgia has received and is supporting more than 28,000 war-affected Ukrainians. The government implements special care projects and provides them with accommodation, schooling, and healthcare services. Let me one more time reaffirm Georgia's unwavering support to the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, all its troops and military equipment from the whole territory of Ukraine. We will stand in solidarity with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. I thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency First Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Georgia. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Spiridon Lampridis, Special Envoy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Greece.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we sadly mark 2 years since Russia's unjustified and unprovoked attack on Ukraine, but also 10 years from Crimea's illegal annexation, actions that we fully condemn from our side. The entire international democratic community has promptly rallied behind Ukraine from the very beginning, condemning the violation of independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of a fellow member of the UN. My country has followed with deep sorrow and agony the horrific destruction and uprooting of normal lives for thousands of Greek-origin Ukrainians that lived for long centuries in the region of the Azov Sea, and in particular around the city of Mariupol, that is currently under Russian troops' harsh occupation. The entire community has been decimated, with people killed, wounded, traumatized, families scattered, children abducted, non-combatants turned to refugees overnight, with their livelihood and properties destroyed, lost forever. We are also deeply saddened by the indiscriminate attacks from the air against the city of Odessa, yet another historic center for Greek communities living in Ukraine and a UNESCO Common Cultural Heritage Site. At this critical juncture, those that support freedom, peace, and the rule of law in international relations must not, however, lose faith. The just and difficult struggle of the Ukrainian people is obviously not only about the country's territorial integrity and sovereignty. It concerns and affects us all, over the entire European continent, the sensitive East Mediterranean region, but also the global community in the sense of food and energy security. If, after all, contemporary revisionists are allowed to force their way in achieving their goals in the mid of the 21st century, then the entire international rules-based order is doomed to collapse, and the very fabric of our democratic societies will be at peril. We all need to play our part in the difficult path, but substantially supporting in every possible way the aggressed party and by condemning the aggressor that bears full responsibility for multiple violations of international and humanitarian law that have recklessly caused extensive suffering to the civilian population, as well as colossal damage in the country's infrastructure and economy. Russia must immediately stop its actions and completely withdraw from Ukraine in line with numerous UN General Assembly resolutions. Greece, in the realistic framework of its capabilities, does and will continue doing its utmost to help alleviating the suffering of innocent civilians and people in need. We have just organized an important international conference on Ukraine's reconstruction in Athens last Thursday, while we intend to continue contributing in every possible way with perseverance, including the energy, transport, and logistics sectors, through our strategic ports constituting a vital providing hub in northern Greece, but also through our powerful merchant fleet in transporting goods, grain, and energy to and from Ukraine. In view of the ongoing humanitarian disaster and human suffering caused by this atrocious war, the international community should begin considering assisting the parties involved to ultimately converge towards a reasonable, peaceful solution that will restore sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine and fully respect the rights and legitimate aspirations of all people living in the region for a peaceful, decent, and prosperous life that they undoubtedly deserve. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank His Excellency Special Envoy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Greece. We have heard the last speaker in the debate of this item for this meeting. We shall now hear the remaining speakers on Monday, 26 February at 10 a.m. in this hall, after the consideration of other items announced in the United Nations Journal. The exercise of right of reply has been requested. May I remind members that statements in the exercise of right of reply are limited to 10 minutes for the first intervention and 5 minutes for the second intervention, and should be made by delegations from their seats. Right of reply have been requested by Democratic People's Republic of Korea. You have the floor.
Mr. President, my delegation is compelled to take the floor to exercise its right of reply in response to the provocative statement made by the United States. We categorically reject the United States' outrageous and groundless claims as grave political provocation and reckless act against the DPRK. The United States is very eager to abuse this platform and deceive the international community for its foolish attempt to justify its illegal offer of weapons to Ukraine while persistently spreading the groundless rumor of arms dealings between the DPRK and the Russian Federation. We take this opportunity to make clear our stand once again that we have never had arms dealings with the Russian Federation and that we have no plan to do so in the future either. We strongly denounce the hostile forces for their rumor of arms dealings as a blood-breeding story against the DPRK, as well as a part of hostile attempt to tarnish the image of the DPRK in the international arena by invoking the illegal sanctions resolution against the DPRK. The United States is the very one that is driving the Ukraine crisis to the brink of world nuclear war by continuously sending notorious lethal weapons, including cluster bombs, to the Ukraine battlefield. As such, it has no legal right and moral justification to slander the normal cooperation between the sovereign states in the field of national defense for peace and security in the region and the rest of the world. The international community should focus on the United States' criminal acts of bringing bloodshed and destruction to Ukraine by providing it with various kinds of lethal weapons and equipment on a large scale, rather than lending an ear to the groundless claim of arms dealings between the DPRK and the Russian Federation, fabricated by some dishonest forces for political purposes. The United States should be mindful that if it persists in spreading the self-made rumor against the DPRK and provoking us groundlessly, it will face a really undesirable result. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The Assembly has just concluded the stage of its consideration of Agenda Item 62. The meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, Pastor. As always.
Pleasure.
That is the best way to describe it.